Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we are going to take a look at building out our batch definition. So, the batch definition is where we bring in the components built in pre-batch. The batch definition is going to consist of one or more batch components, and these are things like your text component, cover, wrap, jacket, card, etc. This is where we are going to include additional spreads or content as needed, and provides a way to pass job parameters to the press, and that requires specific integration to do that. And then lastly, we are going to generate the final press PDF. So inside of the batch definition, we have a few things going on here. First, just like most of our XML files, it's going to start off with an XML version declaration at the top of the file. Now the batch definition has one main element, which is IDF batch. And that IDF batch element has a few key attributes, and probably the most important element that you're going to see within IDF batch is the batch component element. Now, batch component will have things like impositions, substrate definitions, media mappings, pre-batch components order, additional spreads, and press settings, which we will talk about in the upcoming slides. So the attributes that you're going to find within the IDF batch element are ID, which is a unique identifier for the batch, and it must match the ID of the associated pre-batch definition. You're going to have output profile ID, which provides a way to create an alternate version for a set of product templates. And we're not going to get into output profile IDs and exactly how to use those within this video series. That could actually be another mini-series on its own. Next, we have the abbreviation, which is just a text attribute where you can use that value to stamp in your batched output or use it on reports, things of that nature. And then we have max spreads, which is the lift size, and this specifies the maximum number of spreads that each batch can contain before a new batch is going to be created. And then we have something called use batch continuation. Now, when this attribute is true, this instructs the system to generate multiple press jobs by lift size when a single order exceeds the value for max spreads. So, for example, if a batch is released containing a single order consisting of 500 spreads and the max spread's been set to 100, then that's going to result in 5 press jobs that you're going to see where the names are going to be in the form of job name 1 of 5, 2 of 5, 3 of 5, etc. So next we will take a look at the additional spreads. Now, additional spreads provide a way to add additional spreads to the batch, as the name implies. And those are things like batch reports. So what exactly is a batch report? You'll hear different names for this, everything from batch sheet to travel ticket to batch manifest and all kinds of other names. Essentially what it is a report that you can build which provides some summary information or whatever details you might want to include about the contents of the batch that's generated. Now, the other type of additional spread that you can include is what's called a batch continuation sheet, and we kind of hit on this on the previous slide where we talked about those press jobs that would come out in the form of 1 of 5, 2 of 5, 3 of 5. So when the press jobs have to be split apart like that due to the max spread value being exceeded on a single order, you can have what's called a continuation sheet come out on top of that to let you know that a batch or an exception batch has occurred. Now, when you include an additional spread within the batch definition, there are some attributes that you need to include when building that out. So the first one we have here is insert before, which accepts a value of true or false. And insert before basically tells the system that for this additional spread, put it before the first page of the job. So essentially that's going to make the additional spread show up first, or before page 1, essentially. Insert if last page does just the opposite of that. We're going to say insert this additional spread once you've hit the last page of the job, so putting that report at the tail end. Insert range and repeat range are exactly like we've seen in other areas of the system. It basically just says where do you want to include this additional spread? Based on the range you provide, or a repeat range, you could include it more than once, or once in the middle and at the end, or however you want to do that. The next two attributes, related content type and related content URI, are specific to which report is going to be used for the additional spread. Now, we have a completely different video series on how to build these reports that I keep talking about for batch tickets and order slates and things of that nature. And that uses a tool called Jaspersoft Studio. So I'm not going to get into the details of exactly how those are built here, because we're just talking about what's the process for building out these product templates. Now, if you want additional information on building reports, which I would suggest that you become very familiar with the information in this video series before moving to that, you can check out that video tutorial series on using Jaspersoft Studio as well. But that said, the related content type simply specifies the implementation type for the report that's being called on. And we don't really need to hit the details on that. You just need to know the value to put in there based on the report you're building. And then the related content URI is simply the name of the report that you want to call for that additional spread. Page width override and page height override are attributes that have been in the system for quite some time, and I will confess again and let you know that I have not ever used these attributes for anything that I have built, but my best guess without using them is that they provide a way to include additional white space around that additional spread when that may be needed. Duplex is just that. It's a true-false attribute and allows you to tell the system whether the additional spread is simplex or duplex. And then we have substrate, which allows you to specify the name of the substrate to be used on press for printing that additional spread. We have reverse order, which will reverse the order of the pages within that additional spread if it consists of more than one page. And then the rest of these attributes have to do with whether or not the additional spread generated is what is referred to as inline or nearline. Now, before we get into these attributes, which we're just briefly going to talk about, let me give a quick example of what an inline spread is versus a nearline spread. An inline spread simply is going to be generated within the job that's being generated. So if we're generating a book block job that has 50 spreads in it, and we have an additional spread where the value is set inline equal true, then that batch ticket, or that additional spread, I should say, is going to be included in that press job for the book block. Now, when we set inline to false, which means we're going to generate a nearline additional spread, then that spread is no longer going to be part of the job that it's associated with. Now, that may sound a little weird at first, but there's actually some really great uses for nearline type tickets and spreads and things that people have created. So you could create a nearline batch ticket or travel ticket or whatever you want to call it, and you can have the system redirect that to a totally different press, to a network hot folder location, to a office type printer that simply prints on 8.5 by 11 printer paper, or any number of things. So this essentially just allows you to take that additional spread and redirect it to a totally different location so that it's separated out from the job being submitted to press. Now these other attributes, like I mentioned, these are only applicable from device type clear down to name. These are only applicable if we are working with a nearline batch ticket or a nearline spread. So only when inline is set to false. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of these, and if you would like additional information on setting up a nearline additional spread, you can certainly check out the documentation from our website, or you can always contact our support team and we can work with you on getting that set up and squared away. So next we're going to talk about working with substrates. So there's a couple different ways and methods for assigning substrates dependent upon what part of the batch definition you're working with. So these can be defined on an additional spread line like we just spoke about, and you're going to specify that substrate by name. So there's an actual attribute called substrate, and then you'll set that value to whatever the name of the substrate is that we should be using on press for the additional spread being generated. Now we can also use this section within a batch definition called substrate ranges. Now substrate range will include a listing of substrate IDs and the associated substrate to use for that ID, and then throughout different parts of the batch definition you can call on substrate ID of a particular value, which will then look up that ID within the substrate ranges section to determine what substrate the system should use for that particular component. And then we get to batch components, and this is really probably the most important or the most critical part of a batch definition. So first thing I want to say is that batch components, when you hear that, it's synonymous with the press job. Every batch component that you create is going to result in a press job being generated on press. The attributes that you're going to see associated with batch components are name, which specifies a unique name for the batch component, naming strategy, which provides a way to override the system default naming strategy. You have destination type, which specifies the device type that the batch component will be sent to. And a device type is going to be something like, these are the various implementations that we have built into the Infinity software. So you're going to see device types available for Indigo presses, Zycon presses, Kodak presses. There's a hot folder implementation, various things like that. So if you're curious about what other device types may exist, definitely contact our support and we can work with you on what we have. So next we have split range, and this works just like it does in pre-batch. It allows you to basically say what part of this batched output do I want to include. And then we have this attribute called split press job, which is not very often used, but it's one that's been in the system for quite a while. And it essentially allows the system to generate a press job for each input into the batch. And we're not going to get into the details of that. We can, look into that further with you if that's something you're interested in. But just know that that attribute exists. And then we have device groups, which basically tells that batch component what device group to submit that batch component to as the batch is being released from the system. Device groups and the different ways that releasing batches works with device groups is a bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but you can find that information within the Infinity user guide, and again, we can always help out with that if that comes up from a support standpoint. Then we have additional IDs, and this allows a single batch definition to be used by multiple pre-batch definitions. So why would we do that? What's the example there? So consider an example where you have a 5x7 card product and a 7x5 card product. Now those are essentially the same size, it's just one's rotated, has a different orientation than the other. Now, from a batching perspective, we can batch both of those together. We simply just need to tip one of them over and rotate it 90 degrees so that they all are going the same direction on the final batch imposed sheet. So in this example, we have on the customer side, you might have a 5x7 card product, which would have one pre-batch template associated with it, and then you would have your 7x5 card product, which would have the 7x5 pre-batch associated with it. Then on the batch side, we could use this additional IDs element and put both of those pre-batch IDs in it so that following the pre-batch processing of both of those products, they're both going to get fed into the batch definition or use the same batch definition. So next, we're going to take a look at the section or the element called pre-batch components order. Now, every batch component defined will have a pre-batch components order element. One or more pre-batch components will exist in the pre-batch components order element. And this is where you specify how each pre-batch component will be structured in the batch that's getting built. So kind of a real brief example here might be something like the first item in the pre-batch components order might say to include the order slate. Then the second item is going to include the calendar first page. Then the third item is going to include the calendar body, and the fourth item is going to include the calendar last page. Now this list is going to be iterated through for every input into the batch. Now, we don't need to get into the real specifics of this, but just know that this is where we're basically saying include all of these things into the batch in this order. This is how our batch is going to be structured. And then that brings us to the pre-batch component attributes. And these are the attributes associated with each of those pre-batch components that we defined within the pre-batch components order element. So the first one is name, and this is the name given to the pre-batch component, and this needs to match the component type attribute of the associated pre-batch component. May not make a whole lot of sense just yet, but we'll take a look at that in a little more detail when we get into the software. Next, we have the copy range, and this is, it basically specifies which pass to include this pre-batch component on, and that relates back to those pre-batch inputs that I spoke about a little bit ago. Typically, this is going to be 1 to n. I would say probably 99% of the time you're going to specify 1 to n, and if there is a situation where you wouldn't want to use that, you would probably know well ahead of time. So that's what we have for copy range. And then next we have once per pre-batch result only. Now this attribute basically says even though you might have to iterate through the list of elements or the list of items within the pre-batch components order 5 times, you can override that and say only include this one pre-batch component once. Now the classic example of that is when you're dealing with something like an order slate, or what some people refer to as a banner. You don't want to include that for every single pass as it goes through the pre-batch components order. You just want to include it one time. And we'll take a look at that too as we get into the software and see exactly how that works. Next, we have substrate ID, and this is the ID of a defined substrate element in the batch definition. And this is going to map to one of the substrate IDs that we talked about earlier within that substrate ranges section. And next, we're going to talk about media mapping. Now this provides a way to specify different substrates for the same product. This requires that the substrate to use be included in the component section of the order. And this maps the intended substrate at batch time. So let me give you an example. Because that really didn't really say a whole lot there actually. So you might have a particular card product that the customer can choose 5 different types, 5 different substrates for that to be printed on. Now one solution might be to create 5 different products or 5 different sets of product templates within the Infinity software, where each one of those has the associated or the correct substrate defined within the batch definition. And that would allow you to basically specify 5 different substrates within 5 different batch definitions. But that kind of gives us a lot more things to maintain and keep track of, and one way we can work around that by keeping just one single product template is by using this media mapping. So now, as the orders come into the Infinity software, you have the ability to pass in the intended substrate or the intent within the component section of that order. Now when the order gets processed through pre-batch and then comes into batch, we're going to look at that intended media that came in, and we're going to map that to a given substrate that's defined within that one batch definition. So in a sense, we're going to have this media mapping section within the batch definition that has 5 different substrates defined, each one with a specified intent, and as the order comes in and gets processed, we're going to match that up to the correct substrate and ensure that the card gets submitted to press using the substrate that was defined in the order. So very handy feature. Allows you to keep the templates down for products where the only thing that's really changing is the substrate that that product gets printed on. So next we're going to talk about job settings, and this provides a way to pass job settings to the press during job submission. Now for Indigo, we have this page device settings section which includes a list of various PS ops, or PostScript operations, that allow you to set or specify the values of certain job options on press. Now we also have the ability to send job options via JDF for the later integrations of the HP Indigo presses, and then we also use JDF for Zycon and Kodak, but that's handled a little bit differently with those. We actually pass on an entire template of JDF for Kodak as an example for passing job options. So up next, we are going to start building out our batch definition. We're going to add our pre-batch component to the pre-batch definition. We're going to specify an imposition to be used at batch time, and we're going to use and or review the various elements that can exist within a batch definition. So this one's running a bit long here, so we have a lot of information to go through, and I will see you in the next video.